Hello, everyone, and welcome to the First Class Lacrosse podcast. My name is Deemer, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Matt Dunn. We are excited to bring you a podcast today where we recap season 2 of our College Coach podcast. We had incredible guests and another great season. Coaches from the academies who are leading the country's next wave of leaders in Joe Amplo, Cindy Timchall, and Joe Albarisi. Coaches who have brought programs to national recognition, Dan Shimati, Kevin Connery, and Erica Bamford. A coach who has paved the way in our sport internationally and across disciplines in Jen Adams. And coaches who have built dynasties, Kevin Corrigan and Kathy Reese. And don't forget Cindy Timchall here, of course. And a coach off a 2025 championship, Connor Busick, who brought Cornell its first title in 48 years. It's been an amazing season, and we've been super grateful for all of our guests' time and what they've shared with us. Matt, welcome to the show. Let's get into it.
Yeah, thanks, man. As you're going through the intro, it's a little surreal just looking at these names and the fact that we got to interview them. And I think, we've gotten a lot of good feedback over the past year and a half now. So this is our second season of doing this from people that say they like the interviews, and that's awesome. But my response is typically, I can't believe we get to get these guests on, and we just try to get out of the way for them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is surreal and it's exciting. And even looking back at season 1 to season 2, to get to interview so many amazing people, leaders, coaches, players themselves, it's special. And we've learned so much. We've talked about a lot. It keeps informing our decisions and our goals and what we're doing with First Class Lacrosse. And it's been really cool to hear, and we get a lot of anecdotal feedback from listeners. So we appreciate our audience and our community for tuning in.
Yeah, and I'll just echo, because I always forget, Deemer, like what you and I talk about in private versus what maybe we've said on the podcast before or in another public format, which, we probably say a lot of things that end up in all various corners of the internet. But I think one thing that's been cool and kind of a theme of what we've done with our entire business is that you and I are kind of doing this because we're so curious to learn from these coaches. And we get off these podcasts and we're like, man, if that was just a conversation you and I got to have with that coach, that would be pretty cool for us. We hope other people like it too. But I think you and I trying to keep learning has made these a lot of fun. And hopefully that kind of bleeds through in the conversations. And we are by no means expert podcasters. We're still working on that part. But I think our curiosity and maybe obsession to a degree with wanting to keep learning from these coaches has certainly been a fun part of these conversations.
Yeah. One thing I'd add, I was telling someone a couple months ago, I said, one of the challenges with having a podcast like this is I think we were intentional when we went in that this wasn't going to be just an X's and O's podcast. If we had some X's and O's, I think it'd be really interesting. And we have, with some coaches more than others. But it was also really important to us to hear about their journeys and hear about their philosophies and how they got to where they are, because I think that's a black box for young coaches. In other professions like finance or consulting, there's these specific internships, and you get the internship, and then hopefully you get hired for the full-time job, and you put in your couple of years, and then you get to the next promotion. And you can really look at, men and women in their 50s and see what the next, 20 years of your life would look like if you stayed in one of those roles. I think what's really unique about coaching is how all these coaches got into it was so different. Some thought they were going to pursue outside, outside careers, and then they got back into it. Some just like got hooked, and hearing those stories and then hearing how different coaches like work their way up through the ranks, like you see them on TV now and you're like, man, it would be so cool to have that job. But then when you hear about everything they've went through to get to where they are, it's not that sexy. And it's a ton of time and work and luck and getting better and losses. And that I hope has come out of this podcast a bit, because hearing everyone's stories has been really cool.
I completely agree, and it's given me such tremendous respect for a lot of these guys and girls, and I think when you look at these coaches that, to your point, you and I know them, a lot of them, we know them as coaches because 10 years ago when we graduated, they were still coaching. If you were younger and are closer to our peers, but, um, you never really thought of them that way then, and so now having the chance to understand their journey and their path gives me a ton of respect for what they've built, and where they are. And with that, Deemer, I think, talking about doing this podcast, we didn't wanna make it just a blank summary of all the conversations we had because, quite frankly, that's pretty overwhelming to even think about. But we wanted to pull out some themes, had a few questions and prompts, and the first one that I have is, as I just mentioned, we graduated college 10 years ago, this upcoming May in 2016. Having these conversations now in 2025 in the spring of 2026, does it seem like coaching has changed to you since we were in college 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, my first gut reaction is it's some parts have changed and some parts are still very much the same. And I would say one of the biggest things that stands out in my mind, and I'm going to say this all outside of this new landscape of NIL, which is making its way to our sport, but I think is not the same right now as football and basketball, and the beast that they've created. So more in just, what's changed, coaching wise, what stayed the same. Something that I feel like when I hear offensive coordinators talk and when I hear some of these coaches talk on our podcasts, there seems to be a lot more focus around the player experience and a lot more focus around player driven teams and player driven missions. And I think that has also probably been a challenge for coaches, over the last decade of moving towards that. But I think as things have evolved in these 10 years, more and more are realizing that that's that's a new way forward, to where, the dictator, the one voice, the one way of doing things is just probably not getting the same results as it maybe used to. Is that something that you've seen?
I agree, and I always struggle with this stuff of like what's actually changed over 10 years versus what has changed from my perspective because like maybe imagine everything stays the same, but you and I are seniors in college versus 10 years out of college. Like we're going to see those things differently and notice different things. So I try to balance like the moving pieces in this. But I think a few things that were really helpful to get that perspective, because I do think it has changed. I think the core components of it are pretty timeless and universal, and we can talk about those. But I thought Coach Corrigan's interview was great for this because he's a guy that you can imagine being as classic gets. He's been at Notre Dame from the start. He's built an incredible program. And he's talking today about how kids today are just different like than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, and not in a good or bad way, but just different. Like they have cell phones in their hand, they have computers in their pockets we walk around with all day, the iPhone. So our exposure to things, our like attention span, expectations. And he made the point that kids today want to know why, and he said they have good reason to. Like they're curious. You can't just tell them to do something and the answer be because I said so. Well, you can do that, but I think that's where you create a lot of tension and disconnect between programs. And so I thought, to your point of like this connection theme and this coaching the player more, I thought his was a great example. And a lot of the coaches said it, but you just imagine Coach Corrigan being the guy that's like, sorry, man, you came to Notre Dame. This is how I do things. Like, I'm pretty good at it. And here's how we're going to do it. He made the point. He's like, look, I'm still the head coach. Like, I make the final decisions and we're going to do things a certain way. We have standards. But the player has changed, and I've been working to try to understand that and work with the guys and get their permission to coach them the way that I think is best.
Yeah, it's a great point. I liked the line about the permission, because that's something that I think you hear a lot of this rhetoric from when people talk about sports changing and college sports changing. You can't coach kids hard anymore. And he's clearly still been able to coach hard, get results, but also when you hear about what guys think of him, like they think very highly of him. And so I think it shows that evolution, but also getting that player buy-in. And then something else that we heard a lot, I think, Coach Kathy and Coach Jen, the ideas of not caring how much but knowing how much you care. It a lot of coaches, and I think this is going to tie into our next piece on authenticity, but when they build that trust and the players of this day and age know that you care about them, they're going to run through a wall for you. But if you can't break that barrier down and connect, and show them not just being their friend, but show them that you're thinking about them, caring about them, want what's best for them, that unlocks that ability to coach hard, or hey, coach like you've always have in a way.
I'm going to make a point here because this is a personal trap I fall into, and I imagine a lot of listeners do also. And it's that you hear some of these phrases and they're a little frustrating. Like nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care, right? It's a cliche phrase, and I have this problem, and this happened with a lot of our interviews because we interviewed head coaches, and a lot of head coaches now, not all of them, but a lot of them are less and less concerned with like the detailed tactics, and they're so much more concerned with the program culture and these like hierarching meta themes that feel a little abstract. And so I've tried really hard to not be like, I know nobody knows how much you know until you know how much you care. But that was probably the core theme of all of the coaches, was that it doesn't matter. Like it does matter what you know, but this connection and authenticity to the players was something that seemed to emerge from them and become more important in their later years. Where I think most of the coaches said, hey, look, in year 1, 2, or 3, I wanted to create this program. I had this vision. It should be this, this, and this. Because I read a book by Nick Saban and Bill Belichick, and I knew, Coach X, Y, and Z really well. And I talked to them and I said, I want to take all this and do it. And they were super excited about it. And I think they struggled. And I think Coach Connery talked about it. I think, Coach Warren talked about it last year. I think Erica Bamford talked about it a little bit. And just these concepts of growing through becoming a head coach, and their journey has led them into prioritizing that authenticity.
It's definitely something that I think the more we hear about it, the more it also just lends itself to understanding how difficult this job is. Because even when we had some of the coaches kind of talk about their process of getting the job, you're so focused on the vision of the program, you're so focused on the recruiting and what you're going to do there, and you're inheriting something in some cases, or you're starting something from scratch, and you're again, a lot of people, I think too, like you get very focused on your schemes, like what you're doing, but what can fall to the back burner is the how you're doing it and the how your team is coming together. And it does seem like a big theme that people find that revelation of, hey, this needs to be more at the forefront, and if we do this and maybe we keep the lacrosse component more simple, it's going to come together, and having trust in that process. And whereas, even Cindy talked about it, like the paralysis by analysis, like you can watch all the film, you can drill all the technique to death, but these coaches that are, driving these really successful programs are like rising above just the focus on technique and skill development, and really doing everything they can to, build that connection, be more authentic themselves, and see where it takes the program.
Do you think that matters about the program you have? And what I mean by that is, do you think the answer is the same for a lot of these coaches, or because you hear a little bit of different things, and I think they're all successful. And like and I know we mentioned coaching is a little different, but we had an experience where I think you and I really appreciated how well we were taught from a fundamental perspective in college. by our coaches. And we thought that was really valuable to our team's successes. And I think that's part of the reason we got into initially doing what we're doing and teaching players. Now, I think when I reflect, our coaching staffs also were pretty good at the other piece of it too, of creating some of that that buy-in culture authenticity piece. And I think, I played for Coach Zanowski with Team USA, and I thought that was a huge thing that he did an incredible job with. But I guess my question is like, do you think there's some places, depending on the type of player that's recruited there and culture, where one of those things is actually over or under indexes, like a program that has a really type A type of player that they're going to, you teach them something one time and they're going to just keep working on that thing, versus a program where maybe it's just a different type of kid that you recruit and that part needs to be focused on more? Do you think do you think you approach that differently based on your team and players, or is this a theme that you've seen that just generally applies to most of these teams?
Yeah, I do. And the reason I think that is it's, it's not even just the example of like, a team full of like a lot of like type A, kids and students, but also like look at the three academy coaches that we had on. Like I've heard, I feel like a few times, and I remember going to Army practice with Coach A, but there was an intentionality behind making practice like the best part of their day because they were going through a college experience that anyone in the non-academies can really not comprehend. Like I couldn't even put myself in the shoes of what it's like to be an Army or Navy lacrosse player on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's really key that from my perspective that these coaches do have an understanding of what the experience is like and what they're coming into and trying to adapt to that, because I think the players are going to have different perspectives. I think what they're experiencing is going to be unique, and if you're not tapped into that, I think you can be like saying these coachisms that might be falling on deaf ears.
How does one, based off your own experiences, but also these conversations, because I'm thinking about a few of these coaches now that have talked about this. Let's get more tactical. How does a coach, create that experience? Like, what are some keys you think to creating that experience? Because I always think having fun is great. We talked about it with Jen Adams, but you can't have like flimsy fun where you're not getting things done. Fun can be a great tool, and it should be fun. It should be the best part of your day. But coaches also have to win. They have to produce to keep their jobs.
Yeah. So, one thing that I think where it starts for me is that like coaches meeting with players and not just leaders on the team or captains or with the titles, but, players, freshmen, to sophomore to older, consistently, meeting in different parts of the year and like getting that pulse and then and listening to what they're saying, and then when you listen, it doesn't mean that every suggestion or idea is going to be implemented by the coaching staff. But when you're really coming into those conversations, I think as a coach with an open mind and hearing what they have to say, I think you can be tactical, which is probably our next point here to your question around like what you can do to make the players feel heard. And I think if players feel heard and players feel like you have their best interest in mind, that's where I think you can really build the foundation for creating the environment that you want. What environment do you want? Most people say, hey, something that's competitive. Players are holding each other accountable. They're trying to be the best they can be. They have a culture of extra work, right? Whether it's pre or post practice, a lot of those things that you're trying to accomplish, I think it starts from that foundation. So I think that's number one, and I'll pause there and see what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it keeps reminding me of Jen Adams talking about like her three things. We asked her because we always have this bias of wanting to pick coaches' brains and be like, well, what are you doing? How do you teach offense? Like, how are you teaching skill? So we asked her like what fundamentals they focus on, and she was like, I have three fundamental things I always come back to. I like awesome, let's go. She's like connecting, having fun, and competing. And I was like, okay. And then she starts talking about it. And I was like, it was so spot on. And also her energy, you can tell that the players that played for her at Loyola all have bought into this culture of like it can be fun and should be fun, but we're going to compete. And a huge key to that is us connecting. And so that's where I kind of keep coming back to like that example. And of course, you teach as a coach within that, you teach the actions you need to see, the schemes, the principles. If you want players to catch and throw a certain way. And I think all that stuff's really important. But at the end of the day, without the model to hang on of, hey, we're going to compete no matter what we're doing, like we're going to compete. It should be fun. This should be the best part of your day. We should be excited about being here so you can compete and also have a great time doing it. In fact, I think most athletes would say that competition is fun for them so long as it's framed the right way. And a huge part of this, because we're all in this together, is connecting. And I think that word connections one over the last 2 or 3 years, you and I have said a lot and seen a lot and heard a lot from coaches. It's like, hey, it's not about you or me, it's about us. So we have to connect, whether that means on the field with offensive chemistry or defensive stance and posture, or just knowing each other off the field so that when we get to the same spot, we're excited to see each other and we know something about each other's personal lives. And so the Jen Adams example I thought was like, sure, recency bias. That was our last podcast we hosted, but I thought she nailed this part of it in the way she talked about. And I think when you hear her players talk about what it was like playing for her, all of that stuff, they're not just words on paper. Things she says, they're culture of the program.
Yeah, and like so building off that, because I agree. I would say, how do how do you make a more competitive environment that's also fun? I think it really thinks about like how you drill. And I think that it's also interesting because I do, back to your point about like what's changed in the last 10 years. I do think there's some things, like if we tie it to the constraints led approach, I think there's some things that coaches have just been naturally doing for all these years, and now it's falling into this constraints led bucket. Like, so I'm not going to say that all that stuff is brand new, but I think when you pull some things from that coaches can tactically apply to build that environment, it is bringing out more competition in the drills that you do, a winner and a loser, keeping score, bringing the energy as a coaching staff to get the kids also fired up too. Like, you can't just yell at them to get more excited. Like, if you bring that, intentional energy to the competitions and you make that stuff matter more, and then there's consequences, but again, consequences don't always have to just be sprints. Like, consequences can be funny things, or tapping into like your peers and not looking silly in front of your peers. Those kind of things I think can drive more effort and also get kids to love the process more. And the rote skill development, there's going to be a time and a place for that. Not every drill is going to be fun, but I do think it's tipping the scales more and more towards creating those competitive environments. And then you probably can, if you're more efficient with that and you're getting more out of that, you probably can scale back some of the time, some of the time on field. Like, you don't have to have these 3.5 hour practices that are just, mind numbingly repping out every single situation.
Well, yeah, I think that's something we're seeing too of coaches like trying to treat players with as more of adults, and that trust piece is a huge part of it. Where it's like, hey, we're going to keep you out here for 90 minutes to 100. We're not going to be out here 2+ hours, but that's conditional on these expectations we have. And so now there's this trust factor in place, and that's what a lot of these coaches talked about, is building this base layer of trust of we're going to show you we're going to do our part as coaches. We're going to come prepared. We're going to have a practice plan. We're going to make sure the drills are efficient. We're not wasting your time. And the things that we do, we genuinely believe are extremely important to our success, because we're all in this together. We all want success. We all want to perform well on game day, all of that. What we need in return, the conditional part, is when we do a drill, we can't have to keep coaching you guys to bring energy, bring effort to it, to actually compete. We'll set up the environment. But if we're talking about say one day, you're doing a 3-on-2 style drill and we're like, hey, this week we really want to work on like, I don't know, offensively, like slips and flybys. So we're going to, in the 3-on-2, we're going to do that. And 3 reps go by and the players don't do it one time. Like, well, that's kind of breaking that trust of like, hey, we set this up. We want to do this stuff. We could just do something else, but we think this is important. So did we not explain it well, or why are we missing this? We're just not focused today. Okay, got it. But now you're kind of building that foundation, in my opinion, of, hey, there's like this working together. And I think that's what a lot of the coaches said. It's not like we're doing this, this, and this. It's like, hey, this is important for us. We're building a way we think is an effective way to do it that we think you guys will like a lot too, because we can do all of those things. But the conditional part is we need buy-in from you. And so that becomes a foundation then to have that conversation with the captains or your players. It's like, hey, help me understand why, like, we're trying to do this. Yesterday we did it. It did not go well. Like, what are we missing here? Because we want to make sure we can create these environments.
Yeah, I think it's a good framework, and I think, again, that's where having that follow-up meeting, like you said, and understanding and listening and hearing what they're having to say. I do think some of the best teams I've been on have been the most peer led, and the most, like we've been talking about, player driven. Now, I think there's some kids that every coach would probably agree, like, hey, that's a natural born leader right there. But you can develop that, and I think tactically as a coaching staff, throughout the year, you probably need to keep investing in more time to those influential figures on your team so that every time you're trying to get on someone, like, the bad cop is not just the coaching staff. If the coaching staff is always playing bad cop, it's like that you're never going to get all the messages. And then instead of like building trust in a relationship, you're just always the one like raining on the parade. And again, not from a perspective that you have to be their friend, but from the perspective where if you can also, delegate some of that, or your peer leaders are stepping up and, I think really taking charge in those scenarios, that allows the coaches to step back too and keep steering the ship, whether it's tactically, or stuff off the field, or team building type of stuff. And Matt, like, one point I wanted to make too, when you know, Coach A, really talked about being vulnerable, as a coach. And we've even had it. I feel like you had a bit of a, you know, dialogue with Coach Connery on this podcast. Like, when you got there, like, you thought Coach Connery was like this coach, and hearing him talk about some of his nerves and, like, early experiences at Maryland was kind of like, whoa, like, that was really interesting to hear about. And so to me, like, it's a huge takeaway for me where if coaches can get more comfortable being more vulnerable and communicating things with their players, I think that lets the players in today's day and age be like, wow, like, these are real people. These are people that are going through similar struggles or have gone through similar struggles, and they can empathize and kind of get on my level. I think that's really powerful. And when I think about, like, even watching Coach A in the locker room before and after practice, his whole staff was so intentional about, like, putting their arm around guys and, like, communicating with different players. And they spent like a good, like, 20 minutes or 30 minutes before practice connecting. And if we scale that back here to like a high school coach, you know, it might not all happen if you have 30, 40 players on a team. It might not all happen every single day. But if you've got a staff of, maybe it's just 2 coaches, maybe it's 4 coaches, can you work through that entire team across 2 to 3 days? Can you hit 5 players in, stretching? Can you hit 5 players post practice and call different people over? And if you have to have a checklist, like, have a checklist. But to me, that would be a tactical way that a coach with less resources could. And some coaches are working in school all day, so they have those touch points where, Johnny can come in during a free period or during lunch and chat with coach for 10 minutes, and that's huge. But if you're a coach that's showing up after school and you're not a part of like the daily school day, focusing on creating some of that time, I think would go a long way.
A couple of thoughts there. One, just circling back to Coach Albarisi, and this is not only true to him. This is just the example of really emphasizing like these things that we're talking about him and the things that he said on the podcast. Like we have a lot of data points that that's how he is almost all the time. And I say almost just because I don't see him 24/7. He'd probably, I don't like, but I'm so impressed by a guy like him, and I'm so inspired by a guy like him to want to be better because I mean, Deemer, we've talked about it before. We were at the IMLCA coaches convention the last 2 years, but 2 years ago, Coach Pressler got into the Hall of Fame at IMLCA. They had the dinner, and we were there. Coach Albarisi, Coach Chamati, a lot of those guys were there. And I got put at a different table, just like some seating arrangements, and everybody else we knew was at the main table. And Coach Albarisi came over and sat with me. I was at a table with people I didn't really know, and he just came over, sat with me, and just we had the best conversation. That was the first time I really spent time with him. And I left that night. I was like, that was awesome. I just got to spend all night with Coach Albarisi. We had a great conversation. And I kind of realized I was like, he intentionally saw me not get to the table with everybody else, came over, sat with me. And the more I learned about him, I was like, that's just the kind of guy he is. And never like made a thing about it. Just was like, I'm gonna go over there and be at this table. I think he gave somebody else his seat at the main table. And so like to your point of like being in the locker, it's not an act. It's maybe something he had to cultivate and focus on, but it's the way he is, and that bleeds through. And so, I mean, I make that one point just to think of like that was inspiring to me. It's like, oh, okay, he's preaching this stuff about what toughness is, saying, hey, toughness is going to sit with the kid that's maybe doesn't not with everybody else, or put your arm around the guy that's getting picked on or whatever, and like he internalizes that and practices it, which is awesome. And to me, one of the beautiful things about coaching is great coaches become these mentors that people look up to and want to be like. Um, I think to your point of not everybody has the opportunity that a college coach has to have the touch points with their players. And that was something you and I talked about before this podcast of, hey, it's cool we get to interview these people, but sometimes the information that other coaches get is not super transferable because they're not in the same situation. So I think to your point of making a checklist is great. I think one thing high school coaches can do, because I coach high school, is we can leverage technology more to formulate some of these touch points where like that didn't exist 10 to 15 years ago to the same degree. And so I think a lot of coaches might not think it's like coaching in its purest form, but the world's changed. And so being able to send text messages to kids and just um, check up or share a thought or just touch base and create that normal human connection with them, I think is an awesome way coaches nowadays that don't work at the school, that don't get to see their kids in the off season as much, can create some of that relationship.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's let's definitely dig in a little here to, the use of technology and using technology in modern coaching. When I started at USC in 2018, it was, again, or at that time, Instagram was continuing to ramp up in terms of clips and stuff available, basketball, crossover highlights, football highlights, as well as that was where, we were really getting started and utilizing like breakdowns and social media clips and really building our early days Instagram pages. And for me at that time, not that again, it was coming from this place of research. I was just thinking that for myself and working with our offense and just how I was clipping things up, it made a lot of sense to start like sending, you know, different players on the offense clips, shorter stuff, not these long things, not always like not everyone could get in for meetings, but I was feeling like I was able to start building that culture of like, yeah, you come in, you watch film for 15 minutes. We hit the good stuff, we hit the bad stuff, stuff you got to get better on. But also in between, I was like, it's kind of felt like meeting them where they were at, where I was like, hey, if I just saw a quick clip, and then I feel like this bit of information could be something that maybe I brought up to them at practice earlier, but they didn't get to see it, or something that I think they could start using. Let me fire it off to them. And if I had other video evidence or quick tidbits to support that, I would just send it, whether it was through Teamworks, whether it was a text. And I was like, this to me is like the best way we're going to bridge the gap, because I'm not going to be able to sit there tomorrow and work on the question mark shot, unless we have time after practice. But if I can show them where and how and why they could and should be using it, that to me it just felt like it made sense. So, I love your point about using the text and technology. And again, I think, for all coaches listening, like depending on the age, like, sending that to younger players, like you have to obviously apply it to where you're at. But if we're talking about high school here, like this is like what, you could be doing to meet players where they're at with, when they're consuming shorter form videos, they're not going to sit there. They're so scheduled. This is how you can bridge the gap.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, I coach high school and we don't have a film room. I don't work at the school. A lot of the kids play football in the off season, and so some of them I see January and through May to a degree, somewhere in that time gap. And you get to practice, and there's a lot of you don't have a ton of one-on-one time with everybody. You get a little bit, but if you have something you want to teach somebody or the group, and we all know that like teaching something, there's typically not this like one profound like aha got it. It's like brick by brick, teaching a skill, teaching a concept. It's like here's an example, here's it in practice, here's it in a game, and you kind of work that, and eventually somebody gets really comfortable with it and they get it and they do it. And so I think of it as like brick by brick of, can I shoot a text here? I'm watching film, clip. Hey, I'm going to send this to the whole defense. Because I have a group text of the whole defense, and I'll send it. Hey, this is for everybody. Hey, this is one guy got beat. I don't want to send this to everybody, but I want to send it to him and be like, hey, we talked about this. Just want to show you an example. It's actually not as bad as you thought, but like, here's what I kind of see with it. Let's talk about it at practice. And you do that and send them a good play. Hey, this was awesome. This was exactly what we talked about, and you did it. Might send that one to the whole group chat, or might send that just to the kid. For me, selfishly, like I get to get them the information. They show up to practice more prepared, and I go, look, my expectation is I will never send you anything I'll try to keep everything under 3 minutes. I'll never send you anything over 5 minutes over text, because I'll do voiceovers and stuff. And I just won't, because I get it. Like, I don't expect you to sit there and watch 10-minute videos I send you. Everything will be under 5 minutes per day. I do expect you to watch it before practice, though. Is that fair? Or are you guys so busy that's not possible? Like, seriously, let me know. And they'll be like, no, that's fair. We can do that. So that's like like we kind of build that expectation to the point of nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. To me, it's a great way to show kids like, hey, my coach is thinking of me throughout the day, throughout the week, and choosing to reach out to me. And over time, in my opinion, that kid you can coach them a little harder, but they're also going to give a little more because they don't want to disappoint somebody that's spending that much time on them. And so I think that's a way to a lot of coaches today, because we hear from people like, hey, the podcast was great. Like, I don't have those resources. There's 2 or 3 coaches. We have 40 something kids. I have a full-time job. I don't work at the school. So we're trying to figure out how to like make this more of a thing. We don't have a film room. We don't have, all these things, which are very real. So I think leaning into technology, to your point, in an authentic way is a great way to start to bridge those gaps.
Yeah, no, this gets me excited. So first thing you said, I think your question was, is this fair, right? If you ask that in a very genuine tone, I think you're more likely to get an answer from a player that's real. And that is the whole creating the trust and getting a player's permission. If you're like, hey, this is what I think. Do you think this is fair? Do you think this is doable or achievable? And they're like, yeah, coach, like that's great. Boom. Like you have this permission to open up that line of communication and hold them to the standard if it's not being met. So I love that. And again, it's not sarcastic. It's not in a condescending way. it's just like it's a fairly asked question. Um, I think of, again, like the other takeaway, you're kind of like, hey, you're keeping yourself like under 3 minutes, under 5 minutes. Like you just won't do it if it's more, or you got to trim it down. Like I think that's such a good takeaway because it can be very easy to get like really excited as a coach. And then all of a sudden, boom, you're just dumping stuff on their plate, hey, watch this hour webinar. It's just like, no, like I'm not like, because here's the thing, when we're coaching, if you're in it full time or you're like so pumped to be the volunteer coach and you're getting there at 3:30 after practice, like you clearly have an itch or a passion for coaching. What people forget is that these players often don't know that lacrosse is their passion. And even if they're playing in college, the other thing people forget is that they still might not be, and there's a good chance they're not that passionate about playing lacrosse. They like it, they're good at it, and they know that it's a path to something else, and maybe they love being with the guys or the girls in the team. But there might not be that passionate about lacrosse, and that's okay. You can still win like with like players like that on the team. But I think it's true. It's important to understand, and that's where, like, this balance of respecting their time and the other things that they have going on, like, I think it's huge, and not just assuming that, because again, like they're gonna work hard. Like these could be like, again, really type A, high achieving people, whatever they're asked to do, they're gonna work hard, and they're gonna, put a lot into it. But it's just it's really interesting when it comes back to like, I'm like feeling like I'm starting to go on tangents here, but it's like it's sending my brain in like a million ways when I think about this stuff.
It's interesting. I think to your point, that is the trap I've fallen into. Is for me, like I loved sports so much growing up. I wanted to play at the highest level. You go to a certain like college program, and that's just the standard. Like if you get to a top 10 college program, even expand beyond that, I'll just use that as the example. The expectation is that you're competing for a national championship. So you have this like built-in base layer expectation that you can leverage. If you're a high school coach, the expectation is not that every kid on that team wants to play college lacrosse. That might be one of two or three sports for them. They might like it. It's a different proposition for the whole team. And that was something that was hard for me at first to wrap my head around. To a degree, it's like, what do you mean you don't want to be the very possible best you can be and you're obsessed with this? Like there's a balance to that. Some players have that, and some just like, hey, I'm going to play another sport in college. That's the thing I want to be the best at. Or I just, I like playing high school sports, but that's all I want out of this. And so I think that was a challenge for me at first that a lot of coaches probably face. One thing I wanted to bring up that I thought was super interesting is um, this book called Coach to Coach by Martin Rooney that I would highly recommend anybody that hasn't read it. Give it a shot. It's pretty short. I got recommended it a few years ago. It's essentially a parable about this young coach that is what we're talking about, pretty hard on, pretty tough, trying to figure himself out. And this older coach mentor comes and helps him become a better coach. And the thing that stuck out the most to me was him talking about the definition of the word coach, where it comes from and what it means to be a coach. And I never knew this, but it is derived from the word that is used in stagecoach. Like it's a German word, I believe German, and it was originally meant a coach was a way to transport, so to go from one place to another. It then became slang for teachers, I believe, and eventually moved on to athletics. But the general premise of it is that a coach is somebody that helps players or people get from where they are to where they want to go, like a train, like a stagecoach, literally physical transportation. It's metaphorically become this term of coaching. And so being a coach is not about winning games, like it partially is, but I think anybody that coaches feels like it's more than that. Anybody that's had a great coach feels like it's been more than that. And so I love that definition. I've tried to internalize it more of my job is not just to get the kid to approach the ball better. part of it. It's part of my job. But it's helping players get from where they are currently to a different spot to move forward, to advance, to make progress. And so looking at high school coaching through that lens, like it's not just about getting everybody to be this college ready athlete, while it is part of it. But I think that's been a cool way. And when you hear a lot of these coaches talk, those themes seem to emerge where it's much bigger than what you do on the field. Although that's a big part of it, it's more than that.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's definitely a big part of it. But like a question I would like turn right around to you is like when you were in high school, and maybe different depending on different years, like what was like your goal and your parents' goal as it pertained to like college versus playing lacrosse in college?
I have no clue what my parents' goals were. That was just, it's funny now that we interact more with players and parents from our capacity and the landscape's changed. I just thought you went to school and played sports. Like I just thought that's what people did. You go to school, you take class, and then you try out for teams. And if you make it, that's awesome. And so as I wanted to make the varsity lacrosse team at Loyola as a sophomore really badly because I love sports. I always love sports. And quite honestly, it was a huge status thing. Like it was cool. Like if you were one of the sophomores on the varsity, it was cool. And we would go to the games as kids. I was like, I couldn't imagine getting to play in those games. I didn't really think about college lacrosse. Like I don't remember thinking about college lacrosse my sophomore year that much. I think after that, and I made varsity as a sophomore, and I had a pretty, I got to play, which I thought was a big deal. It kind of became apparent that I could play college lacrosse, and I started to focus on that more. And then kind of a lot of my friends were doing it, and I kind of felt like I naturally stumbled into it. So I don't remember having this ambition to play college lacrosse early. I just loved sports and kept playing. But then certainly when I got to that point, I was like, okay, I want to do this now, maybe my sophomore year.
So
Do
then
you?
even when you got to college and you're like whether you had true conversations with your parents or not, like at what point was ever your goal in college to like be on like play professionally and be on Team USA versus hey, like after college I might just be looking at, my career. Like what was that like?
In college, I don't remember thinking about lacrosse after college at all. Like, I don't remember that. I remember wanting so badly to win a national championship at Maryland. I wanted to start my freshman year. I just wanted to start. I just wanted to find a way to not be the worst player on the team because that's how freshman fall can feel sometimes. And then, um, I think I was like interviewing for finance jobs in New York, and I thought that's what you did. Um, and so I don't remember thinking until about a year or two after college when I started playing professionally and really enjoying it and actually realizing that I could do it well. I was like, "Oh, I really like this. I want to keep doing this." And that's when I started to realize the Team USA stuff, how cool it was and how big of a deal it was. I knew about it when I was younger. I guess I never just thought that I was never like a top recruit. I never just thought that was like a path for me, if that makes sense.
I guess like the point I'm like getting to, and I think is really interesting is when you talk about this book and coach to help someone get from where they are to where they want to go. Never in, I would say, a lot of situations is like in our sport, is it, hey, in high school, like I'm going to do these things to help you get to being the best like pro or after pro player like you can be. I think there's times where it's, hey, like I'm going to help you get to the next level, which is like that college lacrosse level, which is what like club and high school at these top programs and things are built around. But when I think a lot of parents are thinking about with this is getting them to that next level to get the best education that they can to set them up for prosperity and opportunities after college. Like I think when you dumb this whole thing down, like that's what a lot of this like in youth sports really comes back to. And what I think is important for coaches to remember is it is more than just lacrosse. And just because you say that, just because you acknowledge that jobs after college or, getting a really good education or other things beyond just playing the sport are important, it doesn't mean that a player is not going to do everything they can to like be the best player that they can for the status reasons, or they are obsessed, or other drivers that push them. I just think it shows like, it serves as a reminder for a coach that these other things matter too. And if you keep taking that big picture view, that like you're going to make an impact beyond just them becoming a better shooter or a better dodger. Like you do have a chance to like help someone get to that next stage, not just as a lacrosse player, but as a better person, as a better student, and someone that can go on and be a leader and make an impact in the world. And if they stay in lacrosse and they make Team USA, like that is freaking amazing, But if they don't, it's also not like any less either.
Deemer, outside of family, who do you feel like were your biggest mentors, influences growing up?
Yeah, I mean, outside of family, like I would say outside of my immediate family, I felt like um I had some relatives who, served as like father figure, coach type figures. And then it was all of my coaches. And a couple teachers, like Mr. Maddox at St. James, and um, a couple at Loyola that I felt like I really connected with. But it was a lot of coaches and a lot of people that like in different stages of my life, they they had this way that they carried themselves and way that they interacted where I was like, I want to be like that guy. Like I want to carry myself like that person. And then when again, our coaches at Loyola were amazing for that. And then Coach Casemeyer and Duke staff and Coach Caputo I was really close with. And then after college, like getting to spend a year with Andy Hilgartner, like still to this day, like when I hear people in Maryland talk about Andy Hilgartner, like it's like, wow, like Andy is the best guy. And I'm like, that is so like inspiring to me. Like, again, who knows if people would ever say that about me, but like that's what I would want to work towards.
I think of like outside of family. I remember some teachers. I always say I remember almost all my coaches. And I think that's when if I ever lose sight of what I'm doing, I try to be like, I hope that some kid one day thinks about me the way I think about the coaches I had growing up. Um, and I think, an interesting thought, because I agree, like people have targeted outcomes, like, and not to get too pie in the sky here, but people want, it's, I think, especially parents, because they're tactical with how they want to raise their kids. And kids kind of absorb those ambitions of, hey, if I do this, I can get to this school, I can get to this school, and that'll set me up for success. We talk to kids all the time, like, I'd love to use lacrosse to get into a great school. That's awesome. That's awesome. I would just say don't undervalue the outcome's great. Don't undervalue what you can get from a great coach, even if you don't get into that great school, or you go to a school that's maybe not the dream school, but you get to play for a great coach there. And I find as I get older, and a lot of people in athletics tell you the same, you realize if you had a great coach, you realize the stuff they said hits you 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, where you're like, wow, I kind of get that more now. Because they held us to standards, they did things a certain way, and they gave me a model for what it kind of means to try to do things the right way or a certain way. And to me, like getting to the school, checking those boxes or getting to those milestones are great, but you're building this character and this identity through these coaches you work for. And that has nothing to do with whether or not you get into Princeton or Penn or Dartmouth. Like those places are great, but if you get to the impact, you'll figure it out. If you're made of the right stuff, if you have the right foundation, the right character, and the right pieces, that from my personal experience, I got a ton of that from coaches, family, raising, all that, great teachers, but also coaches were such a big part. I would say like don't assume it's a failure if you don't get to these like goals you wrote down on paper for where you want to be. Figure out like take as much as you can from the experience because there's a lot there from a lot of coaches. Hey everyone, Matt here. We wanted to take a quick second to pause and talk about our SCL online coaches community. We started the community because we're obsessed with coaching and with learning from people who've shaped the game. Coaches have had a huge impact on both Deemer and myself, and building a place where we could hear from top college coaches and apply their ideas right away felt like the obvious next step. The webinars, the drills, the teaching frameworks, they've helped us coach with more clarity, and they've become a great resource for full staffs who want to stay aligned. If you want something that keeps you sharp throughout the year, you can look at firstclasslax.com/community. That's firstclasslax.com/community, or you can find the link in our description below. Now back to our conversation.
One of the themes that I think kind of ties into what you're saying, and I'll kind of tee this up, is this idea that intrinsic motivation is key. Motivation from within is key in this whole thing that we're talking about. And if we're, again, we're talking about players, but in the context of, what we heard and felt like we gathered from some of the coaches in season 2 is, cultivating joy and loving the journey leads to great buy-in. And you actually sent me this podcast last night from Tim Ferriss, who is interviewing, big venture capital and private equity investor Bill Gurley. And they had this really fascinating discussion around like intrinsic motivation. And Bill Gurley was also talking about, trying to help younger people, explore alternative paths and explore different interests and, kind of speaking to parents a little bit, but also just saying, hey, like we've all been so programmed to, feel like you have to do this and you should do that. And that was something that Coach Danowski would really impress upon us in college. Like, we were, oh, got to go finance, got to do this. And he was always just trying to get us to, one, stay present, but then two, hey, there's a lot of things you can do out there. And if you have the right ingredients, you're going to be successful. And, Gurley kind of mentioned this self-test of passion that he likes and saying like, are you spending your own time to learn and to get better at your craft? And if you're doing that, he thinks that's a real test of passion. What did you think when you were hearing some of those bits on the podcast?
I loved that podcast and I loved the way they framed that. He even says like, hey, he uses the word passion at first, and then he goes, well, passion's like kind of trite these days. People like passion has this like connotation of this, like, whether it's trite or this like thing that, oh, people chase their passion and they, end up doing, trying to be a painter their whole life. But more it's more like, what are you really interested in? And I think a lot of us, myself included, and as a coach, I actually see it, I think a lot, where we have players on the team that think they really like lacrosse and want to play in college. And after a year, I'm just like, I don't think you do. I think you should want to do that. And I remember that because I thought I should want to get a finance job in New York. And I tried it. And I was interested in it for a little while, but then it kind of, that's not what to me like got me excited. And I think the test of like, what are you learning about in your free time is great. Like if you're buying a book off Amazon or going to the library or whatever, or like what topic are you going to read about that's like going to fire you up to keep reading? Or what book do you read 2 pages of and put it down every night because you're like, I should read that because it's good for me to do that, but I don't really care about it. And I think that's a really, really important question to ask. And now this is I think to frame your point, Deemer, he's making the example of people that were like elite in their field. He's talking about Bob Dylan, right? Bob Dylan hitchhiking from Minnesota to New York to meet, I think it was Woody Guthrie, who's his idol. And that's how it kind of starts like expanding his career. And he was obsessed with folk music his whole life. And so he's talking about elite performers there, but I think anybody can scale that down when you're asking like, do I want to play college lacrosse? Well, in your free time, do you like putting your headphones in and hitting the wall and going shooting and getting your workout in? Like, do you enjoy that? Or is that like, And not that you're going to enjoy every time, but does it excite you to get better at to learn how to use your left hand a certain way? Like I finally got this move down. Does that fire you up? Because if so, like playing college lacrosse might be a good thing for you. Might be a great thing. If you don't want to do any of the extra stuff, I'll let you know right now. Like that's probably not the right path for you, and it's going to be hard when you get there. And so, to your point, Deemer, I think that's a great litmus test for people of like people will say, I want to work in finance. I want to play college lacrosse because we're programmed to say those things and we think we should. And to Coach Tenalski's point, like challenge that. How do you challenge it? When you're dreaming, when you're thinking, when you're on your own time, when you're doing stuff with free time, like what do you look forward to doing? What are you excited about getting better at? What gives you energy? Because at the end of the day, we'll use college lacrosse as an example. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of hours. It's a commitment. A commitment means you're sacrificing things. You don't get to go on spring break. You're going to miss things. You're going to miss like a lot of things, actually. You're going to have to stay disciplined and do your workouts in the off season. So if you're not excited about what's on the other side of that, it's going to be pretty hard to have success doing it.
It brings me to my follow-up that maybe brings some takeaways here, for a coach, but also I do think there's an opportunity here to bring the parent back into the discussion. How do you, if you can, cultivate that? And on the flip side, is there anything that a coach or a parent does that could have adverse effects to someone, like finding their passion or finding what they are obsessed about, and really like obsessing about it and seeing where it takes them?
I don't know if I have enough wisdom to answer that entirely accurately,
That
but
is the question, right? Like that is how do you, if you
yeah.
want more people obsessed, like, can you cultivate that, or is that just like that's just what a kid's journey becomes and that's what they become obsessed about?
Well, Deemer, let's bring it back. Let's circle back to authenticity here because I think that's a through line is so if you're authentic as I'm not a parent, but if you're authentic as a parent, if you're authentic as a coach, like Coach Corrigan says this for coaching, like kids can sniff out BS. They can tell, like just like I can tell when a kid doesn't want to play college lacrosse and says they do. The kids will be able to tell when I'm putting on something that I don't believe in. Like they just will over time. And so like to instill this, I think if I'm not doing it myself and I expect kids to do it, like that's not going to work. And so like the answer is like I love coaching. I listen to coaching podcasts. We talk to these coaches. Like I clip film and text it to the kids, maybe too much sometimes. But I know that I like that. That's still my interest. That's still something that I want to keep doing. Um, and so I think like being able to share that with somebody and somebody see like, wow, that's pretty cool. Or like you like the fact, Deemer, you worked in New York for a year and then you left to start first class lacrosse after a year. That's an authentic and courageous move to do because everybody else from Duke, a lot of people, they go work in finance in New York and they don't leave a banking job at Barclays to go run lacrosse clinics around the country. And so I think that gives you ground. I'll just use anybody that does something like that to say like, hey, here's my experience with it. How did I know to leave? Well, like I thought about just training my lacrosse career and training, teaching lacrosse all the time. And I like the finance job, but that's like what drove me and why I still love what I do and still drives me. And so I think to your original point, like how do you guard against that for people? When you model that behavior, it becomes a lot easier to give other people permission to do it. Like parents or coaches can tell a kid something, but if they see the parent or coach model something differently, like they're not going to believe it, right?
Yeah, I think it's really well said. I do. And I do think that idea of modeling and taking action and showing it, I think that's where, if I'm a kid and putting myself back in the perspective of us being younger, and Mark Cassini always, mentions the quote, emulate until you can innovate. And I love, and I think Jen Adams might have mentioned like emulating, in some of her podcasts. But if you find the people that you want to emulate and be like, that to me is huge. And that's why people value mentors, and that's why people value coaches. And if you make that connection and you're trying to emulate, all the positives you can find, I think that is what starts cultivating more interest and more obsession. And I think that's why tying it to kids playing multiple sports and kids being exposed to different things at young ages is, I think that's a goal of a parent, to help a kid find what they're interested in, and probably the cautionary tale is like, I'd imagine maybe like trying to audit yourself and being like, hey, am I just really interested in this? And I keep like showing my kid this because, and then they're gonna hopefully get really interested in it too. Or am I being neutral enough where like they actually feel comfortable like expressing what they're interested in? And again, just my situation. um if anyone who's listening like knows my dad, he's one of the most like laid back, you know, neutral stoic guys you'll probably meet. And I just remember like his focus was, if you give 100% effort and have a great attitude, I really don't care what you do. And it kind of sounds weird, like I actually, Deemer, like I don't care what you do. Like it could feel weird like kind of say, but like in the essence of it, I'm actually so grateful for that, because it gave me the permission to pursue what I was interested in. And it was basketball in 8th grade, and football was always the love of my life. And then like lacrosse kind of came about. It didn't become my favorite sport till junior year, and I was the best at it probably of all the three. But then when I wanted to quit my job, like and do this lacrosse thing, they were like, "Are you sure? Or maybe one more year?" And I was like, "No, I think I'm sure." And they're like, "All right, like follow your gut."
Well, it reminds me of even on the Ferris and Burley and Bill Gurley podcast, talking about the McConaughey example, which it's in his book Greenlight. He talks about it, of his experience with his dad, of choosing to go to film school when he was training to be a lawyer his whole life. And he's from just outside of Austin, Texas, I believe. And his dad was understood to be this like no nonsense type of guy. And so Matthew was training to be a lawyer his whole life, and then kind of had this drive, desires, like, I don't think I want to do this. He had a chance to act, and he wanted to go to film school, and he was so nervous to like call his dad and like let him know and tell him. And so he makes this whole big deal out of it and calls him and tells him. He waits for the right moment, thinking the right exact time. And all his dad kind of says after pausing, he's like, well, if you're going to do it, don't half-ass it. And McConaughey talks about how that was like such a powerful thing to have been told, because it gave him permission, but it also gave him accountability over like us, like how to approach it. So I think it's similar to like what your dad told you, right? Like, hey, I don't really like follow your interest, but like you're gonna do it. It's not about what you do; it's about how you do it. Um, and I think for a lot of it, like to me, that was really empowering, because it's like, hey, go after things. And that, like, I think to a degree, what we're doing in the lacrosse world, this, for anybody listening, this felt wrong for me for a while. Like, I was in consulting for 3 years. I felt really scared to leave that job and felt like I was doing not what I was supposed to do, because most of the people I know have had pretty traditional in an office 9 to 5 jobs. And that's what I spent all of my college thinking I would do, build my resume, internships, and all of that. So hearing some of those things, it's like it gives me a little bit of courage and conviction in kind of following that, but with the standard of better, give everything you have to it. And so I don't know. And I think that's just like hearing you talk about your scenario and that piece. Like, I think it's a great question to be asking yourself, if your heart is always somewhere else, what can you do about it? Or like, how do you assess over and over that you're going after things that like you genuinely are really interested in? Because typically you're going to do the best at those.
And maybe going off that, maybe another takeaway for coaches here, in the role that you play is, if we can admit to ourselves that not all of our players are obsessed about being, college or pro lacrosse players, but they understand that it could be an important part of their path and their journey to getting where they want to go. Maybe as a coach, one of the things that you could do is when you take that intentional time to have conversations and get to know them and support them, maybe you give them that avenue genuinely where they could express the things they are truly interested about without feeling like they're going to be penalized because coach thinks I don't care about lacrosse. Like that could be an interesting thing that I'd be curious if, anyone actually applies, because let's be honest too, after you spend all this time doing something, it might be hard as a 15, 16, 17-year-old kid to tell mom and dad that, you know, early on, so maybe like as a coach, just another thing like is that you can have conversations like that and give them the courage and the power to like keep exploring those other interests in other ways so that they're cultivating that. And I would think if you're thinking about like a scoreboard or a win as a coach for a person or someone off the field, you help them figure out like something they were super passionate about. That's going to drive them well beyond their years of playing lacrosse. I think whether you're a high school or college coach or youth coach or club coach, I think that's a win in coaching.
It brings me to one final reminder and from the coaching interviews, and that was Jen Adams talking about success for significance. And, success, she kind of talked about like winning games, having a good record is success, right? Significance is much broader than that. And the hard part with significance is you often won't know of it until 5 or 10 years down the road of how significant you were in somebody's life, maybe even beyond that. But you kind of have to believe in what you're doing and the impact that you could have on that person. And so I thought that was a great reframe of like, yeah, success, it's a thing. We want to win games. We do that. But that's not the only thing we're doing here. And so I love that framing of that significance. And I think you and I, talking about it, know that to be true. And I have to imagine anybody that's played for a great coach or anybody that coaches feels that it's much more than just wins and losses. And that's like I think that's the reason you and I are on this podcast today and doing what we're doing is it's not just about throwing the ball into the net.
Yeah, and finishing that, I would say in the significance piece, there's probably going to be times where you had significance, but you don't hear about it. And I remember, I don't know if you've heard this a lot, like I always remember and kind of wanting this for myself, but also coming more to the reality that it probably won't happen. Like I remember a lot of coaches say like when you get invited to your players' weddings, and it's like that's like a sign that like you had significance in their journey. But I think the reality is like the farther you get removed from college, and also how weddings are these days, like more expensive, they're probably smaller than they were at sometimes. Like you might not get that wedding invite, you know? You might not have the player text you and say, "Hey, thank you so much for all you've done for me." But it doesn't mean that the impact you made is any less, but like maybe it's realized over a longer time frame, or again, maybe it's never acknowledged. But as a coach too, like how do you continue to find your fulfillment in like this journey, I think is what everyone continues to look for, and it's part of mastering the craft, it's part of building the relationships, it's part of your own journey to becoming more authentic. And I think it's an exciting one, and it's one that I'm thankful to be on and be on with you. And it's we have a lot of shared experiences, but we also have a lot of different experiences and playing days and work days. And it's I'm pumped that we did this podcast too to kind of sum it up because there's a lot of good stuff to talk about.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to kind of wrap it up to the way we started it. There's a lot of ways to go with all the cool conversations we've had with coaches this fall and winter so far. We probably barely scratched the surface of like examples from a lot of these coaches, but I think the themes are pretty consistent of that that authenticity piece was a huge driver for a lot of them. This meaning of significance just beyond what you do on the field, the ability to cultivate joy and fun in competition and practices with their athletes and kind of shepherd the program. And so I know that you and I will keep churning through these for the rest of the spring here. But I think, Deemer, unless you have any final thoughts, we can wrap up here.
We appreciate, our audience for tuning in. It was an exciting season 2, and Matt, as you just said, be on the lookout for a slightly new format to what we did last year instead of the in-season podcast. We're excited for some more conversations, a varying range of guests, and excited to keep building the First Class Lacrosse podcast.